Hi everybody, and welcome back to 2BeLikeChrist for John chapter 13 Bible study. It's raining outside right now, so I'm content to be inside sitting at my desk. I thought it would be a good time to record this. When it's nice outside, I always want to be outside. It's rainy season right now, so it rains like every day. That's good for productivity, but not always good for my mood. John 13. Not a particularly hard chapter to understand, get your head wrapped around the concepts, but it is difficult to practice and to apply. So we'll talk about some of that as we go through here. We got 38 verses. Jesus is sitting down with his apostles to eat the Passover meal. And we'll talk about that, what it is, very briefly, as we open up with verse 1. So let's read verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So what is the Passover? The Passover was a Jewish feast that was celebrated annually to commemorate God delivering his people from Egyptian slavery. You can read about that back in the book of Exodus. It was celebrated on the first month and the 14th day of the month. And just so you know, that's not January. They were on a different calendar, a lunar calendar instead of our solar calendar. So the first month, the Passover took place around March, April, late March, early April. And so that was their first month. So it's the first month, 14th day. Just remember Jewish months. You can, Exodus chapter 12, verse 14 says, "This day shall be to you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast." So they were supposed to do this from the time they left Egypt all the way back in Exodus up until actually this day that we're going to talk about in John 13. Before God delivered his people in Egypt, he sent 10 plagues to punish the nation and Pharaoh. And the last plague was the death of all of the firstborn of Egypt. But God made a way for them to save their firstborn children. They were told to kill a lamb and to put its blood over their doorpost. And if they did that, God would see the blood and he would pass over their house and their firstborn wouldn't die. And so that's how we get that name Passover. Yeah, I think the words of verse 1 are some of the most beautiful in all of the Bible. Especially when it says, having loved his own, talking about Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Jesus' death is right around the corner here in a few hours. Typically, when we approach a big moment in our lives, our focus turns inward on ourselves, what we need to do to prepare. But here we're going to see Jesus loving and serving his apostles in the very last hours of his life. He loved them in the hours leading up to his death, and that love was going to carry him all the way to the end, or to the point of death, as he was crucified. And you think, if that resolve had slipped, if his love had slipped at any point while he was on the cross, he could have gotten himself off. He claimed as much, and he certainly displayed the power in his life to do it. The reason that he stayed on the cross was because he loved us to the end. It was for our salvation, not his benefit. Verse 2. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. So we probably should have put those two verses together. Jesus is saying these things while something is occurring with one of his 12 disciples, something bad. While Jesus and the apostles were eating the Passover meal, John reveals that Satan had already, quote, put it into the heart of Judas to betray Jesus. He was corrupting. There was this corruption seeping in. We're going to see Judas betray Jesus in the next couple verses. Well, next couple chapters. He leaves the Passover meal early to conspire with the Jewish authorities. Now, there's a lot of discussion about this phrase. Let me read it again. When the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot. People ask, okay, that language, what does it mean that the devil put it into him? Is this like the devil made me do it kind of a situation where Judas didn't have any choice? The devil took control of him basically and made him do this sin? And I think the answer is no. That's not the way that we should interpret this verse. The Bible never leads us to believe that Satan has the power to force us to do things against our will. So what does this verse mean? How should we understand it? Well, I think let's go back to the beginning of the Bible, the very first sin with Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, they were in the Garden of Eden, and the serpent came to Eve, and he planted this idea, this temptation in her mind. And Eve had a choice to make, to either accept or reject the idea that Satan had put into her head. He comes to her and he's like, oh, I know God has told you not to eat this fruit, but here's something to think about. And it was a lie, but that's what he's trying to do, plant a seed and hope that it takes root. That's really what temptation is. And so the same is kind of true for Judas's situation. Satan put an idea in the mind of Judas. He knew that Satan knew that Judas had a weakness for money, and so he presents him with this opportunity to make some. And it includes betraying Jesus. And it was up to Judas what to do with the idea that Satan presented him with. Would he cast it out of his heart and mind, knowing that he should never betray Jesus, or would he allow it to take root and grow? Unfortunately, Judas permitted Satan's corruption to enter into his heart and to stay there and to make its home there. And so I think that's the way that we should interpret it. Certainly, Satan does tempt us, presents us with opportunities to do wrong for some kind of personal benefit or gain or whatever it is. We can throw those things out. We can resist temptation, and God promises that he'll help us do that if we are attempting to do it. But if we don't resist it, then the idea presented to us and introduced to us by Satan is going to grab our hearts, and we're going to go down a path that we shouldn't. Let me know if anyone has any questions about that down in the comments. I can maybe clarify anything that wasn't clear. Or if you have any other thoughts on that. Let's read verse 3 through 5. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garment, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. In chapter 12, if you remember, we discussed Mary washing Jesus' feet. We talked about how this was common back in those days. A wealthy homeowner would probably have a servant who was there at the door, and he would wash the feet of the homeowner and then any guests that came in, because the roads weren't paved. They were dusty and dirty and didn't want all of that being dragged through your house. And just as a courtesy to your guests, someone would wash their feet. But it was a servant who would do that, or a slave. Here, that was chapter 12. Here in chapter 13, Jesus, who received that honor from Mary in chapter 12, takes the position of a servant, and he washes the apostles' feet. Jesus assuming the position of a servant is incredible, considering what we just read in verse 3. It says that Jesus had come from God and that he was going back to God. Jesus would soon be in heaven, unified and glorified with God once again, in an incredible glory that's I'm just absolutely beyond us to understand. And yet, he takes this lowly position, making himself the servant of the apostles, people that he had created. I mean, you got to think about that. The more you think about that, the more amazing it becomes. Is Jesus had made each of these individuals. I mean, made them like he put them together, their parts together, bound their cells together, and he's washing their feet. This would have been contrary to everything that the apostles had ever known. The superior didn't wash the feet of the inferior. And truthfully, it's contrary to our culture as well. Generally, when you get up into a high position, you think that people now are going to serve you, not that you're going to serve other people. So it's kind of ingrained in human nature, but not evidently ingrained in God's nature. It's not who he wants us to be. Verses 6 through 11. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterwards you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "The one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, "Not all of you are clean." So when Jesus makes it to Peter in his foot washing, Peter he objected. He couldn't allow his Lord to wash his feet, and he was shocked at the scene in front of him. And Jesus tells Peter that he's not going to understand what he's doing now, but one day it would make sense to him. Peter, though, continues to object. He's not going to have it. And Jesus then responds to Peter, and he tells him that if the lesson that he's teaching by washing their feet is so objectionable to him, then he can't be one of Jesus's followers. Right? He's got to learn this lesson. He's got to accept the lesson that Jesus is teaching. Otherwise, he's going to have problems with being a disciple. And upon hearing this, to Peter's credit, Peter just immediately recants his objection, and he asks Jesus to wash not only his feet, but also his hands and his head. So he's like, "Well, if that's the case, Lord, then wash all of me," because he's implying, I absolutely want to be a part of who you are and be your follower and be your disciple. And so if washing more of me is beneficial to that process, then do it. Peter thought that he was respecting and honoring Jesus by refusing to let him wash his feet. But what Jesus told him though that what he was doing was essential. And when Peter found out that it was essential, that it was necessary, he was all for it. I kind of like this about Peter. I like this response. Peter certainly did not always have all of the details of Jesus' ministry sorted out. All he knew was that he wanted to be a follower of Jesus. And if that meant admitting that he had just said something dumb and recanting his objection to Jesus washing his feet, then he was willing to do it. I think that's admirable. He's trying to honor Jesus by not letting him wash his feet. But when Jesus makes it clear that he needs to do it, he needs to allow it to happen. He's like, "Okay, Lord, well, if you tell me that's what I need to do, then I'll do it." When I think about Peter and Paul, who we'll read about more in Acts, but many of you already know who Paul is, when I think about those two men, I usually think of men who are very different in their personality and probably in their temperament. I don't know if anyone else thinks like that, but reading their characters, I don't imagine them to be like the same person. But I think in some of these attributes that we just talked about, they're actually very similar. You think about it. Peter tells the Lord, "I don't want you to wash my feet," because he's trying to do what's right. He's trying to honor his Lord. And Jesus tells him that he's wrong and that he should change his opinion about it. And he says, "Okay, Lord, well, if you tell me to, then I'll change my opinion." He's zealous about, well, he was zealous both times, even though one of the times he was wrong. Paul's kind of the same way, isn't he? Just in a different, the specifics are different, but the overall idea is kind of the same. Paul thought he was honoring Jesus by being a Jew and persecuting Christians, and when Jesus comes to him and tells him he's wrong, and he's more than willing to admit that he was and change. And he doesn't just change, but he does it with great zeal, like Peter. So I'd never thought about that before, but some similarities. You notice that being able to admit that you're wrong seems like a pretty important attribute if you want to be a follower of Jesus. Having the humility to do that is a mark of some of God's great servants in the Bible. Jesus tells Peter that it would be superfluous for him. I had to use that word because I just learned it. But superfluous means like over the top. So Jesus tells Peter that it would be superfluous. Now I sound intelligent. For him to wash Peter's feet. or sorry. Jesus tells him it would be over the top for him to wash his hands and his head also, because he was already clean. And from this we learn that Peter must have had generally good hygiene, at least on that day. But all of the apostles, he said, are clean. You guys don't need a bath. But then he takes that imagery and he says, but not all of you are clean spiritually. There's one of you who's going to betray me. All right, verses 12 through 15. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garment and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you." When Jesus finished, he resumed his place at the table, and he asked the apostles if they understood what he had just done. The apostles honored Jesus as their superior. He was their Lord, their rabbi. They knew that he had come from God in heaven, and they knew that he was greater than them. And Jesus didn't tell them that they were wrong. In fact, he acknowledges that he is greater than them. But Jesus served them as though he was their servant, as though he was inferior. And he told them that his actions were intended to set an example. As he had treated them, so they were to treat one another. No matter their rank in the eyes of men, they were to be servants to their fellow man. And I think that applies not just to the apostles and their future work, but to all Christians. Jesus served them by washing their feet, but it was only part of his overall mission of service to the world. Jesus was preparing himself for the greatest act of service that there would ever be, his death on the cross, for the benefit of his inferiors, all of us, all of his creation. And just a side note here, and an application, you got to think, Jesus even washed the feet of Judas, who was about to betray him. Judas was going to mistreat Jesus, and Jesus, being omniscient, knowing everything, he knew that Judas was about to mistreat him. He knew it as a fact, and yet it didn't change the way that Jesus treated him. And I thought about an application for that, just the way that I think about situations of service. Excuse me. Our suspicion, at least my suspicion of mistreatment, often keeps me from serving certain people. You know, if I think there's some risk involved, or maybe they're going to try to take advantage of me or something like that, I'll often withhold service from them. Jesus was certain that he was going to be mistreated by certain people, Judas here in particular, right? He knew it as a fact, and yet he did it anyway. We can't know ahead of time if somebody is going to mistreat us or not. And so, well, something to think about, I think, is that Jesus' teaching, like in the Sermon on the Mount of turning the other cheek, we're instructed that we ought to treat people well even after they've mistreated us. And so when we're in a situation where we have a suspicion about somebody might do me wrong if I go over there and serve them, well, Jesus is already teaching that you ought to treat somebody well even if they do mistreat you, even if they do take advantage of you. So maybe those two things need to play together when we're considering whether or not we should serve someone based on a suspicion of being mistreated. I hope that made some sense, because I was having a real hard time getting it out in my head. You probably noticed. Let me see if I can try to salvage that idea for you. Jesus tells us that we ought to treat people well, even after they've mistreated us, after the fact. So don't let the risk of being mistreated affect you being good to somebody else. Right? I think that's what I wanted to say. Hopefully that makes some sense. But let's move on and get off that, because not getting that out quite the way I want. All right, another application. We already talked about this at the beginning of the chapter, and that's that Jesus' words in this section are not very hard to understand. I mean, his actions speak volumes, and it's not complicated. Be a servant to people who are less than you because this is the way that God treats you, right? Pretty straightforward. I mean, this is basic Christian talk. So it's not mentally challenging for a greater man to serve a lesser man. Like, I understand that idea, but it's challenging to follow Jesus's example. It's challenging to put it into practice and to put our pride aside and to serve people and to risk being mistreated sometimes. And people not appreciating what we do for them. I know that's hard for me when people are ungrateful. And that may be why this it's not hard to understand, but it's hard to put into practice. And that may be why Jesus includes this statement in verse 17, where he says, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. So it's one thing to mentally grasp them, it's one thing to know them, but where is the blessing? The blessing is in doing them. Okay, verse 18 and 19. I'm not speaking of you all, or I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I am telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am he. So as we already talked about, there was one among them whom these blessings and words that Jesus just spoke would never apply. Jesus knew the 12 men that he had selected. He knew their character. He knew their secrets. He knew what they were hiding from him. And he could read Judas's heart even while he was sitting there at the table. You remember in John chapter 6, verse 70, that was a long chapter, Jesus said, did I not choose you, the 12? And yet one of you is a devil. Judas's betrayal had been prophesied in the Old Testament. It's prophesied in a couple different places. Here, Jesus quotes from Psalm 41, verse 9, which reads, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. Judas is literally eating the bread at the same table as Jesus, and he's about to stab him in the back. Jesus tells the apostles that this upcoming betrayal, or rather, he tells them of this upcoming betrayal so that when it happens, they're not going to be caught off guard. And rather than being caught off guard, their faith can actually be increased because they'll realize that Jesus is in control because he already told us about this. Okay, so a little bit of a side note here, kind of jumping ahead, but if you know the rest of the story and how the events of the next night transpire, you'll know how the apostles responded when Jesus was betrayed and Judas came with the Jewish officials and arrested him. Jesus had just told them in the last chapter that he was going to die. He tells them here that he's going to be betrayed by somebody in the same room as them. And yet when it happens, are the apostles, their faith, is it increased? No, it's rocked, right? Not in a good way. It's shaken because they can't understand what's going on. But they should have a little better, I think, than what they did, because Jesus has just told them. He says, I'm going to die. I'm going to be betrayed by one of the 12 people sitting in this room will betray me. And yet when it happens, the rest of the apostles are just like blindsided by it. And a point of application there, and Jesus told them that they were going to be okay. Everything was going to be okay. He knew that all of these terrible things were about to transpire, and it was going to be okay. They were going to see some things that were odd to them, probably not what they expected in the Messiah, but ultimately the situation was under control. Jesus tells us as Christians that everything's going to be okay, that there isn't anything that's going to separate you from the love of God, that there isn't any possibility of a situation turning out in a way that's not great for you, even if it means you leaving this life. You'll be with God, right? Things are going to work out. But in the heat of the moment, do we always remember that Jesus has a perfect track record for bringing people through storms? No, right? I'm I'm part of that group. We don't. And often we act just like the apostles did, where they forgot everything that they had been told and they ran scared. Verse 20. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. Verse 20 seems to jump back to the verses that Jesus was talking about before, about serving one another. Jesus was going to send out the 12 apostles into the world to share the message about his sacrifice on the cross. And they were going to be servants to other people and mirrors of what Christ had been to them. Those who heard the apostles and accepted their message and accepted Jesus, in turn accepted God's message, because that's where it had come from. And Jesus has been preaching God's words this whole time. And this is a very similar statement to one that Jesus makes in Matthew chapter 10, verse 40. Whoever receives you receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. And so there's this chain between God the Father and then the work that we do here on earth through Jesus. Verse 21 through 22. After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, Truly, truly, I say unto you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. Jesus now returns to this idea of his betrayer. He tells the apostles that someone sitting at that table is going to be the one who betrays him. And I find it really fascinating that the apostles don't know who this is. They spent probably a tremendous amount of time together, and yet they don't know which one of them is fake. Judas evidently was no slouch at keeping his secrets. He wasn't sloppy in his hypocrisy. And it's kind of scary because, the same thing happens in the church sometimes. You have people that you think you know and trust, and that they're one of you, they're followers of Jesus doing their best, and in reality they're keeping dark secrets that may end up ruining them in the end. But Satan is sneaky, and he can convince us to be sneaky about our sins. So anyway, the apostles, they don't know who it is. And I just find that interesting. Verse 23 through 26. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Unlike most popular depictions of Jesus eating the Last Supper, the Passover, with his apostles, they were almost certainly not sitting in chairs. I've seen a lot of medieval photos where they have them pictured in chairs, and that's almost certainly not the case. It was customary, especially at feasts during this time, for people to lie down on a cushion or a type of couch, and they would eat laying on their side, and then the other people would all be laying next to them around a big table in the middle, or maybe a couple tables. And that's, I think, the scene that we have here. Verse 23 refers to one of the disciples, not by name, but by this interesting description, the one whom Jesus loved. And this appears to be the way, this is the way that John refers to himself in his own gospel. And I used to think, wow, it's kind of arrogant to call yourself the one who Jesus loved, but I don't think he meant it in any kind of arrogant way. Certainly Christ loved all of the apostles, and we can have that same relationship with Jesus. There certainly is no question that John had a special relationship with Christ. He was one of the 3 apostles who got to witness some special things like the Transfiguration. He the revelation, which thankfully we have some time before we study, Jesus appears to John and he gives them that great vision of heaven. So, yeah, there's no question John had a special relationship with Jesus and a privileged relationship with him, but that's the way that he refers to himself in his gospel, and we'll see that as we finish off the book. I think I'm just going to leave it there. John was next to Jesus at this table, and from some other seat at the table, Peter, of all people, he made some kind of a motion to John to ask Jesus about the identity of the person that he had been talking about, the betrayer. And if you have brothers, I don't know, I can just completely imagine Peter doing all kinds of charades to get John to get the information from Jesus, right? The voiceless mouthing of words and things to get him to do this, but it seems very in line with the way I imagine Peter just had to know, and he gets John to ask, and John does it. He says, "Lord, who is it?" It says that he leaned back and he asked Jesus privately, "Who is it?" And the reason I say privately is because we'll see in a little bit that the rest of the apostles don't seem to know anything about what Jesus is going to tell John. And so he seems to be the only one who's privy to this conversation. This wasn't this was asked between him and Jesus, and no one else heard it. At least that's the way it seems. So Jesus evidently had a piece of bread in his hand when John asked him this. And he told John that it was the individual whom he would hand the piece of bread to after he had dipped it. Jesus then gave that bread to Judas Iscariot. Verse 27 through 30. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "What you are going to do, do quickly." Now no one at the table knew why he had said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, "Buy what we need for the feast," or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. After taking the bread from Jesus, the text says that Satan entered into Judas. And I think this should be understood in the same way as verse 2 that we already talked about. Satan entered into Judas by Judas's permission, not against his will. Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." By this statement, Jesus reveals to Judas that he knows what he's about to do. He knows what he's up to. And I find it shocking that Judas does it anyway. You know, you would think Jesus is looking you in the eye and he had to know, he could read his heart when he said this to him. And he does it anyway. And it just goes to show you, I think, that you can mentally acknowledge something in your head, but the affection of your heart can lead you away from what you know is right. Judas had seen plenty of evidence that Jesus was from God, that he had this miraculous power, that he was who he claimed he was. Like, he had no lack of evidence. I can't help but think he really believed that he was who he said he was. So how does he leave that room and do what he does? Well, I think it's because there's a difference between what your head recognizes to be true and where your heart leads you and is governed by your affections. Judas was in love with money, and it made him act irrationally. You might look around the world today and you might ask, how can Christians who are convinced, rationally, logically convinced that there is a God and that he has written the scriptures for us, how can they go off and live in sin? And I think the answer is because there is a difference between what the brain knows and the affections of the heart. There's a difference between knowing stuff about God and loving God. And I think that's an extremely important distinction to make, and a question that we all need to ask ourselves. Do I just know stuff about God? Facts, details, apologetic material? Do I just know that stuff, or do I actually have a love for God that is accompanying that? Because I'll use myself as an example. There's a time in my life I can remember when I knew there was a God. In fact, I've never really questioned that. Just go outside in nature and take a hike and realize that, look at the creation. It's like, it's clear, as Romans chapter 1 says. It's clear that there is a God. I've never questioned that. But I've lived in ways that I shouldn't have lived. How? Well, it's a heart problem. It's not a head problem. Well, it's probably both, but there's a God. And I knew that I'd be called into judgment if Jesus came back and I was living in that kind of a situation. And yet it was difficult to pull myself away from it, because my heart was in love with something else. My love wasn't for God. He wasn't my greatest joy and my greatest, the greatest affection that I had in my heart. It belonged to something else. And so it pulled me away. And so I think we absolutely have to be careful and do a check on ourselves that I'm not just filling my head with knowledge. I actually... that knowledge is transforming my heart in the direction that it needs to go. You don't want to have one without the other. Okay, so I'll just say that and leave it there. But that's how Judas could walk away, even though he was one of the 12 most privileged people in the world, in the history of the world, to walk around with Jesus. The question then is, why did Jesus tell him to do what he was going to do quickly? And that's a question that's had a lot of debate about it. There's all kinds of different opinions, and I think it's kind of hard to say. But let me just give you one idea. It may have just been that Jesus was ready to complete the work of God. He was about to go to the Garden of Gethsemane and pray, and then he would be prepared to go to trial and be crucified and die, and to complete the work. The prophesied work of Judas was an essential part of God's plan, and the events of the crucifixion couldn't proceed without it. And so he's basically just telling him to go do what you have to do, because the time is now and these events are at hand. The other apostles, they didn't understand what Jesus had said to Judas and why he had said it. Judas kept the money bag. And the apostles thought that maybe Jesus needed something for the feast and he was supposed to go buy it. And Jesus wanted him to do it quickly. But they didn't know. And that's part of the reason we know that the conversation between John and Jesus was private and not said in front of everyone. Why did John tell us that Judas went out at night? Well, there's been some discussion about this. It may have been intended to communicate nothing more than the time of day, just a fact that he includes here. Many people, and I suspect as well, that maybe there's a symbolic reason for including this, especially with John's themes that he runs through this book. Jesus is preaching in John's Gospels, or his Gospel, are filled with statements about the light and the dark. Jesus was the light of the world. Judas chose to leave Jesus' presence and go out into the night. He abandoned the safety of the light, and he would stumble in the darkness, just like Jesus had said. So that may be also, that may be the reason that that detail is included. Verse 31 through 33. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and glory..." Whoa. Let me start over. Verse 31. There's a lot of pronouns in here. Verse 31. When he had gone out, Jesus said, Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. All right, so the time of Jesus' crucifixion was at hand. We've talked about this in terms of his glory, time for him to be glorified. Jesus would quickly Jesus' enemies would quickly gather at the call of Judas, and they would be there to arrest Jesus. And Jesus here would quickly be lifted up so that all men would be drawn to him while he was there on the cross. Both of these things were going to take place. By his death, he would save the world, and God would glorify him in the redeeming work, and he would glorify God in the redeeming work. When Jesus' death and resurrection were complete, he would ascend back to God and be glorified with the glory that he had before humbling himself to come to the earth. We'll see a little bit more of that language in John chapter 17, especially in verse 5. Jesus returning to his previous glory. Jesus used the term little children here as a term of endearment for his followers, and it seems likely that this is maybe where John picked it up. Because when we get to 1 John, closer to the end of the New Testament, we'll see John use this term 7 different times. And you got to think, maybe he got that from Jesus, because he refers to his younger Christians in this way that Jesus is here referring to his followers. Jesus was about to leave them, and they weren't going to be able to follow him. He had previously made a very similar statement like this to the Jews. John chapter 7, verse 34, "You will seek me and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come." Here, he seems to be talking about his death on the cross. There's some discussion about whether he's talking about his death on the cross or he's talking about his ascension back to heaven. I've seen some convincing arguments both ways. I think he's probably talking about his death on the cross, but I can be persuaded otherwise. Up to this point in his work, his disciples have been able to follow him everywhere, but they're not going to be able to go to the cross with him and suffer with him. This is work that he had to do, and he alone could finish it. Verse 34 through 35. "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." A question that a lot of people have here is, in what sense is this a new commandment? If you're familiar with the Old Testament, or even earlier on in the Gospels, some of the Gospels that we've studied, you've come across a similar statement to this, love one another. Actually, Leviticus, which is the third book in the Bible, chapter 19, tells the Israelites, or who would eventually become the Jews, that they should love their neighbor as their self. Okay, so that was present in the law of Moses 1,500 years before Jesus said it. In what sense is what Jesus saying new? The first part wasn't necessarily new, but the second part was definitely new. Let me read that verse again so you can see what I'm talking about. Here's the first part. Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another." All right, we've heard that before. That's the old part, but here's the new part. "Just as I have loved you." They were to love one another, but that commandment was given new meaning following the sacrifice of Jesus. The world had never seen love like Jesus had when he went to the cross for the sake of the world. It never had such a high standard before. It was a love that forever changed the definition of love. The commandment Jesus gives to the apostles here is a call to an elevated understanding of what it means to love someone, in light of the purest display of love that the world has ever witnessed. They're going to witness the cross, and in light of that, the statement, love your neighbor as yourself, or love one another, is never going to mean the same thing, because the world has never seen anything like the cross. So in this sense, it's new. It was by learning to love each other like Jesus loved them that the world would know that they were his disciples. And so an application point there, an important one, I think, the mark of discipleship is love for one another. At least that's one of the marks. Christians pride themselves often on different strong points in their faith. They elevate certain aspects of religious life. You'll find different denominations that emphasize different things, local churches that put priorities on different things. But the question is, are we as Christians and as churches known for loving one another? Because that isn't a debatable emphasis, right? We don't get to discuss where that fits on the priority list. That's top of the priority list because Jesus said that it was. He said, by that, people will know that you're my followers. I don't know that there's another distinguishing mark that's so clearly stated in the Bible. Of course, there are many, but especially out of the mouth of Jesus. He just says this with tremendous clarity. People are going to know who you are by the way you love each other. And so we should take that very seriously. This is another example, I think, of one of those teachings of Jesus that it's not mentally challenging to understand, but it is hard to put into practice. Because loving one another, loving someone well, takes time. You think about your spouse, if you have one, or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your child, or your, I don't know, even your dog. But not to compare, never mind. I'm going to get myself in trouble. It takes time to love someone well. It takes time. It takes sometimes emotional fatigue. It can take money, depending on their needs and what. Yeah, it can take money. It can take personal inconvenience. You might have to do things that you don't want to do, but the person that you're loving needs or wants, it is going to require you to lack some sleep, probably, especially if it's a child. But all of these also apply not only just to like your immediate family, because I think people are pretty good at applying them to their immediate family, and especially to their dog. But think about the other Christians. I think that's probably where we are weakest in this category, is that when we leave the church building, are we still thinking about those other people? Are we still loving those other people? Because we all know, and God knows, that there's all kinds of needs among those people. There's people who don't have loved ones or immediate family that can care for can love them the way that they need to be loved. And so it falls on us as Christians to care for each other. And that care takes a tremendous amount of time. And all of these other things that we mentioned, money, personal inconvenience, lack of sleep. Loving somebody can be a full-time job if you want it to be. And really, you can easily consume every second of your waking hours in pursuit of loving other people well. You really can. I mean, there's no shortage of things that you can do to make the world better, to make the church better, and to make people feel like they're more loved. And, sometimes I just wonder if as congregations and churches, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to market ourselves and what events need to happen and how we can better our Bible study. And I just wonder, we spend a lot of time and money and resources on those things. We rack our brains to think about the ways that are most effective. And I really think that maybe if we just put some of that aside and said, how can we love people in this congregation better? We might go a lot farther in our pursuit to show Jesus to people on the outside. All right. Let's finish this off, verse 36 through 38. Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered him, "Where I am going you cannot follow me now, but you will follow me afterward." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times." Peter wanted to know where Jesus was going, that he wasn't going to be able to follow him. And Jesus told Peter that he couldn't follow him to where he was going, but that he would follow him afterwards. And if you know the story of Peter and what he's about to do in the next couple hours, which Jesus mentions in chapter 38, the fact that Jesus tells Peter that he's going to have a chance to follow him after his death is in itself an amazing display of love. Peter is going to deny that he ever knew Jesus in the next couple hours to save his own skin, right? Like betraying your friend. It's kind of terrible. He's like, "Oh no, I don't have any idea who Jesus is," because he's afraid he's going to get in trouble. He turns his back on Jesus, but here Jesus' words reveal that he's already forgiven Peter in the future for his denial. That's something that only God can do, because he only knows the future. But it shows that God is willing, even ahead of time, before these things even happen, to extend forgiveness, and he knows that Peter ultimately will ask him for that forgiveness. And so that's a beautiful thing. Peter then goes on to affirm, well, I should make one other comment about this. Some people think that when Jesus says he's going to a place where they cannot follow, that's talking about the ascension, him going back to God permanently. And then he tells Peter here that he will follow him afterwards. Some people say, oh, well, that doesn't mean, it's not referring to after his death and his resurrection, that the apostles will meet up with him again. It's saying that the apostles, or Peter specifically here, but really all of the apostles, they will be with him. They will follow him to heaven eventually, right? So there's some discussion about that, and you can decide which interpretation you want, or you like better, but I just wanted to throw that out there. All right. Peter, after hearing Jesus tell him that he cannot follow, he affirms that wherever Jesus is going, he is going to follow, and that he is even willing to lay down his life to follow Jesus. And upon hearing this, Jesus reveals to Peter that what he's going to do in the upcoming hours in his betrayal, and he gives some of the specifics there, that the rooster is not going to crow until Peter's denied him 3 times. And, I kind of wish we could see a little bit more of the response of Peter here as to what he thought of that. We know he took Jesus' words seriously and took rebukes from Jesus, and I wonder, just how exactly he took that. It would interest me to know. But we aren't told, because that's not what we're focused on right now. Focused on Jesus, and that's a good thing. So that is chapter 13. Probably a little bit longer of a video. I can't see the time exactly on it, but there's a lot going on here, and we will do chapter 14 in one chapter as well. And then we are, we're cruising to the end. When we get to chapter 14, we'll only have 6 chapters left. So making good progress. Thanks, everybody, for hanging in. And remember, notes are all online. Link in the description down below. And the free ebook is down there as well. Finally got my copy of the Matthew notes, and I'm editing those right now. So hopefully it's on its way. Hopefully it won't be too long before I get that out as a final edition, and then Mark and John will soon follow that. So thank you, everybody, for your support and your kind words, and everybody who encourages me all the time. Till next time, bye.